My name is George Knapp, your occasional host. What becomes of us? What becomes of our soul after we die, the physical death? Are we good enough to make the cut after we die? And we assume there's an afterlife. Many of us assume that anyway. We point to encounters with angels that are told through the ages, though we're warned about fallen angels as well. Beings of light are reported, beings of darkness too. Yin and yang, the oldest story of all, the only story really. But what if we are being manipulated on an indescribable scale throughout human history? What if the good and evil are really the same thing, and the supposed battle between those two forces is more of an act than an actual fight? Barry Fitzgerald and Brian Allen, his co-author, have tackled the biggest questions of all, tying together all manner of things that we talk about on this program: supernatural, paranormal, ETs, science and technology, and religious texts mixed in there as well. All of it combined in this big pot of spiritual stew. And the result is something that won't go down the gullet very easily. The Deception of Gods and Men is the title of their book. You know, the Irish have this saying, and I've used it on this program and in other circumstances before. They refer to places where the world is thin, as the Irish say, meaning places where the line between our world and other worlds, other realities, is thin. And sometimes the one can bleed over into the other. They can come here, whoever they are. Maybe we go there, too, wherever there happens to be. Irish-born Barry Fitzgerald has nearly 30 years' experience within the world of the supernatural, which has taken him to all kinds of levels of intrigue and mystery. He's had this natural progression in the books that he's written and subjects that he's covered. Some of those books we've covered here on this program: In the Mists of Gods, Banshee, and a couple of others. The Council of Three is one. His new line of research has taken him out of his comfort zone and into areas of Irish myth, legend, and folklore, leading him into shadowy depths of the underworld, not only in Ireland, but around the globe, uncovering some pretty shocking information that is described in a book he co-wrote with Brian Allen called The Deception of Gods and Men. Barry, it's great to have you back.
Hi, George. It's great to speak to you.
I was reviewing the transcripts of interviews that you and I had done before, including one with Stephen Mira, and how we started talking about commonalities in the investigation of things that are paranormal, supernatural, that there appear to be links between them. And it's a theme that I've pursued, maybe not as long as you have, but looking for commonalities between UFOs, ETs, gods, angels, demons, cryptids, cattle mutilations, all that stuff. And there are some. And there are similarities that we'll talk about tonight. You've been chasing that for a long time, but it seems like in looking back, you were on the trail of this book a long time ago, and it seems like you've reached this conclusion, this place, in an uncomfortable sort of a way, that you're not entirely comfortable with describing your findings. Is that correct?
It's funny you should say that, because looking back after I finished this particular book, The Deceptions of Gods and Men, I went back and looked over some of the previous books, in particular The Influence, which looked at the biological implications of what was happening when these things came through and tried to approach us, and what our bodies were doing at that specific time. And seeing how 10 years ago that particular story was going to be connected directly to this one, and in greater detail. And I was just blown away by seeing that. You know, initially I thought this story came about because of my interaction on the Island of the Dead here in Ireland, and it was a horrific experience. But I thought it was that had put me onto this particular phenomena. But no, it wasn't. It was something that I had come across years before, which was playing itself out as the years progressed. And you're right. You know, we were seeing this commonality that was filtering its way through a lot of the fringe research fields, and introducing high levels of deceit and deception. And that was something that was infuriating me. And, you know, I got some feedback from a reader down in New Zealand, and he said, does this book mean that I shouldn't go near anything paranormal wise. And I said, no, the book is not designed for that. The book is just to wake us up to challenge what is coming through. And by challenging, then we will see the greater deception unfold. It certainly wasn't to scare people off. It was to make them change their perception slightly, not to accept the first thing that comes along.
Let's start with, can you give us sort of the thesis, the overall premise of the book in the broad strokes, and then we will dig into the journey that you made to get you to this point. So describe the sort of the structure of where we're going, and then we'll jump back to maybe the Island of the Dead.
Well, the book itself looks at these common factors that slip through many of the fringe research fields. And a lot of the listeners will understand phenomena such as missing time, mischievous nature, abduction, mutilation, deception. Now, that in itself are just a small sample of common factors that we find in ufology. But that also rolls into earth spirits. That also neatly rolls into jinn. And that also rolls into the old gods. We keep pushing the boundary back further and further and further. Now, when we try and follow this phenomenon by the way it appears, we end up getting nowhere. We ended up driving into a brick wall, so to speak, because it only goes back so far. Whenever we really started pushing this back, we were seeing this deceptive aspect to it that was unfolding. And what we needed to do was to track it via the phenomena in which it interacted with us. That opened up a whole new avenue for us that brought us right back to the doors of Babylon. And that has been a really eye-opener for us. Now, the book itself is designed to really break apart these fields of commonality and to really expose what is coming through the veil and also try and highlight possibly where it's coming from and the origins behind that.
It's a fundamental question for all of us on this planet, in this life, the struggle between good and evil within ourselves, within societies, the idea that there are angels and demons, that there's good and bad, that there are beings of light, beings of darkness. Your premise is they can all be the same thing, that the grand deception is there's one force and it pretends to be different things, but it's all really the same thing with the same aim, right?
That's absolutely right. It's of the same coin, both faces of the same coin. And this story that we tend to find this, and I call it the broken record, this particular story of good versus evil, of them versus the others, it's all the same thing. And we tend to find this story can reveal itself even twice in a generation. And it's the same story, fundamentally at the core, it's the same story, time and time and time again. And what really started to irk us was the fact that we seem to forget. As a species, we've forgotten and we don't listen to the old stories anymore. And that fundamental core of the story of one side versus the other is something we see all the way back through time. And the manipulation of us in particular always evolves itself around these subject matters. And that has been very, very damaging, I believe, for us as a species. But as we get further into it, we'll break it down and see what is hiding behind that, and primarily where it's possibly coming from.
I describe you as, a boots on the ground investigator. You go out into the field, you go into the pit of hell, you go into spooky places, haunted buildings. You try your best to confront whatever these things are head on. You had an experience on the Island of the Dead. That can be sort of an example so people can get a sense of how you work and how fearless you are. Go ahead and tell us what happened.
Well, we were designing a series of books called Legend Seekers here on the island, which really delved at what we were intending to do was to inspire our youth back out onto the landscape and away from the PlayStations and the Xboxes, and get them back into the environment. And we came across this particular story, which we call the Island of the Dead. Ironically, we didn't know until 10 years later how true we actually were when we said that. But this particular island was known as a place of oracle. And it was a place, even from the medieval period, that people were coming from all over Europe to go to, a small island in County Donegal on the west of Ireland. And this particular place, as legend would have it, is it would test you physically, spiritually, and mentally. You would actually, it would feel like you were walking through the depths of hell. And so we went, and Cormac and I were co-author. We've heard many stories, of course, of that particular nature, and we tended to go, oh yeah, here's another one, and off we went to investigate, not actually understanding what we were about to step into. And getting to the island in itself can be relatively dangerous because of the nature of the lake in which it lies, and the rocks are very, very shallow, and it can easily take the bottom out of a boat. But by the time we got to the island, we cleared permission from the church, and off we went. Now, this particular island, it was claimed, as I said, was a place of oracle. And for them to give us permission, initially the church said, there's nothing there on the island. We don't know why you're going there. And we were saying, well, we're just following the old ancient maps. Well, the maps are wrong. There's nothing there. Now, even looking at the satellite image, we could see that there was something fundamentally still within the island itself that matched the old maps. But we said, look, we would like to go anyway and see. And it turned out that particular place is exceptionally potent on levels beyond our understanding. And the church did try and harness that. Now, this was a place that was being used by the Celts, and no doubt it was a place that was being used by the Neolithic thousands of years before. This was a place, one of those liminal places that you spoke about opening the show there. And in itself, the church couldn't work with it. And by order of the Pope, that place, that island was shut down, and it was duplicated on another island on the same lake. And today you can still go try and appease your sins and whatnot on the fake island, but the original island is still very much there, sitting quietly. And when we ended up going to the island, there were these unusual pits that the vegetation didn't grow in. And it was very, very odd because the whole place, there was much high grass and fern growth, and many times it was over our heads. Yet these pits, the growth didn't seem to grow in them, and no one had been on the island for years. I mean, like hundreds of years, and there are no wildlife on the island, and it was just very, very odd. But they were the only places that we could camp, in the pits. And we set up the camp, and off we went to explore, and we found the remains of the old church, the old graveyard, and all of those things that were on the maps were on the island, as per the stories and the legend associated with. And it was only when night started to fall, when the sun was beginning to set, that's when the entire signature of the island changed. And it's a very, very hard thing to explain, George, but you feel the entire air, the atmosphere of the whole place turns on its head. And you're very aware, your instinct is really whispering to you at that point, something is not right. And that particular night, I have to say I'm an avid stargazer, or was at least an avid stargazer. And that particular night, I never ventured out of the tent. And the dog, my dog that was with me, Max, he even buried his head underneath the sleeping bag. And I said, that's very unusual behavior for him as well. And Cormac was in a tent further down in his own pitted area. Now, what I can describe is, as I was landing in the tent, it felt like a wave washed through me continually, just wash after wash after wash. It was almost like a magnetic pulse that was washing through as we lay there. Now, I did not know that Cormac was experiencing the same thing. And that in itself was the initial introduction to the island of the dead. And just shortly after that, that's when the vision, if you like, happened, in which I was able to see the ruins of the church. And I have to say, people will take ayahuasca, they'll take all sorts of magic mushrooms and everything else to have these experiences. I didn't even have a cup of tea. The experience was so intense that when the image of the church was shown, there was a pit that was beside it. And within the pit were serpents. And the serpents were furious that initially that I was there. I should not have been there. And they were exceptionally distraught. But I have to say that the fear that was generated at that particular moment in time was like nothing I had ever experienced before. And I've been involved in paranormal research, as you rightly stated there, for 30 years. But since doing and getting involved with the mythology and folklore of the island, I've had more experiences with that than I've had over the last 30 years.
So the fear being just way out of whack, just way out of proportion for what was going on?
Way out of proportion. Completely out of proportion. And, looking back on it, to say that, well, you've seen a pit and there were serpents, that in itself should not have made me afraid. But this was beyond even fearing for my life. This was excessive. It really triggered this fight or flight within me. Now, come the morning, I have to say, by the time Cormac had woken, I had the tent broken down and both myself and the dog were in the boat waiting to go home. And I said to Cormac, if I ever experience that again, I'm done. I'm retiring. That's just too much.
Let's jump into some examples of the deception that you outline in this book. This Reverend Robert Kirk, the story you tell early in your book. Who was he and what happened to him?
Well, Reverend Robert Kirk, he was an exceptionally intelligent man of 1682. And he was a member of the Scottish Methodist Church in Aberfoyle. It's a small village that's located near Stirling. And while in 1682, it's alleged that he had these meetings with these beings on Doon Hill. Now, the Doon Hill is still very much there. It's still very much part of the village, and people still go there to try and commune with these things. And bear in mind that the story that I'm about to tell you is just simply a mask in which they interact with us. So Reverend Kirk was there, and he became entwined with this two-sided story that we spoke about before, about the fact that there were warring factions within them. And essentially what he was dealing with was the fairy. And from the Scotch perspective, they call them the Seelie. And within that, there were two factions, the Seelie, who in themselves loved the human race, same old nonsense that they keep telling us. They love the human race, and all they require is our adoration and help with fighting the other side, which is the Unseelie. And the Unseelie have a deep hatred for humanity. And it seems that Reverend Robert Kirk went above and beyond and tried to bring peace back to the Seelie and the Unseelie. And unfortunately, it cost him life. He ends up getting involved in situations that he was told either that he could come with them and stay in their realm, or he would be killed. So that was two options. And they found his body on the hillside And they believed he had died of a heart attack. Some had said it was possibly a changeling that was left. Either way, his body was interred in the local church. And it was believed that that at a certain time that he would return to. It was during a wedding ceremony, and he said, "When I return, please throw the iron dagger, because that will mean that he can return and the spell will be broken. Otherwise, he would be lost forever." Now, he did make his appearance during the wedding party, but instead of people throwing the dagger, they were left dumbfounded because they knew he had died, and yet there he was standing. No one thought to throw the dagger, and he disappeared and was gone for eternity. So that's the story of Reverend Robert Kirk, and he left a diary behind, and that diary in itself is called Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies, and it describes his journeys and dealings with these particular creatures.
And people would hear that now and say, elves and fairies, come on, what is this, Tolkien? It's J.R.R. Tolkien or something like that? They're not real, elves and fairies. You make the point that, as Jacques Vallée has, as John Keel did, that over the centuries, these are the same kind of entities, just in different forms and different names.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Without a shadow of a doubt. I've had my own experiences with them as well.
Wait a second. Tell us, what was that? What happened?
I was on a mount, or a hill here in Sligo, in the west of Ireland, and I was staying on top of an old passage chamber. It's a Neolithic passage chamber that was built just before the Great Pyramids of Giza. And just at the turn of nightfall, that's when these people, for all intents and purposes, they appear. They're not like what Disney would associate little tiny creatures with wings and things like that. They're certainly not at all. They portray themselves as being very much like us in our appearance. And they were walking away. Now, this is where I got an insight into the phenomena itself, in that when they appeared, I could clearly see two walking away from me. And when I lifted the camera to take a photograph, because it was odd that they were walking through a flock of sheep and the sheep didn't move, I thought that's unusual, because if I moved toward the sheep, they would break apart. And I took the photograph, and the camera only saw one, yet clearly I could see two. And I thought maybe it's double vision. But then I realized that one was slightly shorter than the other and was wearing a slightly different color and blue jacket.
So it's two, it's not one, yeah.
It was definitely two. At least that's what they were portraying. And that let me understand the phenomenon from a camera perspective. The reason that this phenomenon does not like cameras is because it sees what's there, not what they want us to see. Yeah. That really set the grounding then for the way forward in understanding the phenomenon.
As you dig into folklore, mythology, stories, folk stories in Ireland, Scotland, the UK, you notice that the good beings, the good fairy, and the bad ones all do the same stuff. They come and take us in the middle of the night against our will to some unknown place and do what they will. But essentially, the good and the bad do the same things. And it's not just these entities, it's throughout supernatural and paranormal phenomena.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very, very much so. Really, when we look at the various different ways that we would interpret them, we see that the phenomena remains the same underneath.
So angels and fallen angels versus demons. The good
angels
ones, the
demons,
good, the good angels are here to help us and protect us, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's another perfect example of the story. And a lot of people wouldn't like to hear that angels didn't exist before 584 BC. So the big question is, well, if they didn't exist before then, what are we calling on now? And that in itself, the book really draws out some very uncomfortable things that we need to consider about what we perceived things to be, how they wanted to be perceived, and how they hid their tendencies within those masks.
Your theme, though, is that it's a false dichotomy. The angels as our protectors, as examples to be good,
Yes.
are setting this up when they're really working in conjunction with the bad.
It's all of the same coin. As I said before, it's two faces of the same coin. And when we go back and we look at devils and angels, that's exactly what they are. You know, the fallen angels. What are they? They're angels. They're the same coin, just two different faces.
And you delve into modern ufology, our perception of these beings of light, the Anunnaki, or versus the little grays who abduct us, but they're healing us. They take us on board ships and they heal us and they really care about us. Versus the reptilians who are really evil and want to do us harm. Basically the same thing. They're both the same, different sides
Basically
of the same coin.
It's an uncomfortable truth. They're the same thing. And you know, there's another connection that we tend to see as well, and it's not readily spoke about within ufology. But we tend to see it more within the realm of the earth spirits, the jinn and the old gods. It's their aversion to iron. The Greys hate iron, along with the earth spirits, along with the jinn and the old gods.
Now, why would that be?
They all are afraid of it because they can't shut us down. And I've had first-hand experiences of that myself with the Greys and their aversion to iron. And I suppose to understand it, we have to understand the magnetic field is produced by the body itself. And understand that when iron is introduced to a magnetic field, it promotes the magnetic field, it strengthens the magnetic field, it becomes a lot stronger. Now, when we go back and we start looking at these particular beings and when they come to us in the middle of the night and do what they do, then we have to begin to look at our own biology and understand what is happening there, because a lot of these things will attack when our iron counts are low, and many have become anemic. For instance, the incubus and succubus, 9 times out of 10, they'll attack women over men. They'll attack when they become anemic. And so they wait for the iron to lower. But when you're wearing iron or you have a higher iron count in your system, they tend to stay the hell away from you.
I guess the big question then, the obvious question is, what are they doing? What's the game? What are they after? Why do they need us? Why would they go through this drama of pretending to be good and protecting us from evil? Why deceive us at all?
That's the old hook and bait, and that's the way that they manage to connect to us, is through the hook and bait. That in itself, I suppose, you know, I heard recently one person making a remark. I can't remember who it was now, just offhand, but I remember them saying, "Those who have the body win." And that is very, very prevalent with this particular phenomena, and that the end game is to try and hold on and use you as an anchor, so that they do not return to that void from which they came.
Eventually, we're going to have to get into the other part of your thesis, is that the afterlife does not exist, that it's all made up by them to deceive us, presumably to keep our minds active and not paying attention to what the ultimate game plan is. Is that right?
There is some things that we need to consider when looking at this particular phenomena and how they fool us. But to do that, we have to understand our own Trinity, our own sacred Trinity of the body itself. The fact that, you see, it becomes cloudy within today's world because we use the terms soul and spirit as and we find it interchangeable. But that was never the case. Going back through the old manuscripts and things, they were two separate entities, where today we've joined them as one. And to recognize that again, I think is very, very important, and to understand that the soul's responsibility was to make sure that this meat suit, the body, stays alive as long as possible, so that the spirit can experience. And primarily, this then really lets us delve into the area of the psychic, and the idea that as we propose in the book, that all psychic phenomena is the actions of the soul. It's that keeps the body alive as long as possible.
Wow.
When the body ends up in a situation, for instance, where this phenomena tries to latch on, after that particular experience, sometimes people can find it very overwhelming, and they'll develop certain psychic abilities, prophetic of nature somewhat, and they believe that they're gifts from this experience. That is not what we put through in this book. What we are proposing is that is a responsibility of the soul. It is the soul that is stepping forward to the plate to make sure and try and make sure that does not happen again.
You make the argument in many parts of the book that we really don't know what these things look like. The Greys, ETs, the reptilians. There are screen memories. They assume different shapes. They look like owls with big eyes to us, or deer with big eyes. And what we remember may not be what we saw. We also know that the UFOs themselves, which we assume is some kind of technology, that they change shapes. They appear, they disappear, they split apart, they mold together. They seem to be immune to what we understand the laws of physics to be, that they are, in fact, shapeshifters as well. So we really don't know what any of these beings or entities look like.
Well, that is the truth of the matter. And that's why within the book we don't use names per se, because names are preloaded. And the use of demon, fairy, and stuff like that, we stay away from. There's an introduction to them, but we stay away from for the main part, because there is no identity behind them. They come from a place of absolute nothing, and we see that through the likes of the Skull experiment, which was conducted back in the 1990s in England. It was a 5-year study into the world of the beyond and what was coming through it, and we see it in other aspects as well. For instance, Robert Monroe, during his experiences as well, he comes across this particular phenomena and mentions it in some of his work. But for the main part, yes, they don't tend to have a physical form per se. That's how we perceive them. That's how they wish to be perceived. And that in itself comes from this understanding that during the first 20 seconds is vital when this contact is made, because within the first 20 seconds, the truth of the nature is usually given to us by our own soul, and that is delivered through the body's response. So with the first 20 seconds, we tend to detect whether this is right or whether this is wrong. But or if it overrides more than 20 seconds, that system can be overridden by them, primarily because we're forced into the theta brain rhythm. And that particular brain rhythm is where we tend to do a lot of daydreaming. It's where hypnotic suggestion can be made. It's where meditation happens. It's also where false memories can be planted. So the body is being forced into theta. And that in itself has been a real eye-opener to come across. I'm still going through some of the paperwork from European scientists at the moment in which they were seeing phenomena across Europe.
Okay. When you and I first met, Barry, when we first met, it was to talk about hotspots. I was sharing with you some of the notes about Skinwalker Ranch and asking you and Steve Mera about hotspots that you had investigated, places where there's a cornucopia of weird stuff, all kinds of strange phenomena, all happening in the same place. And the assumption was, I think, at Skinwalker, for example, as at places you investigated, that these are all different phenomena that happen to occur in the same spot. In fact, you suspect that they are all the same phenomena, just showing in different forms.
Yes, we do. We're now following that particular line of investigation. And the magnetic hotspots, they're not huge by any mean, but what we are able to see is that these particular areas tend to resonate this particular type of phenomena greater than others. Now, when we start looking at this, for instance, the Scottish Seelie and Unseelie, let's say, the Seelie, the ones who want our adoration and all that stuff tend to happen primarily within the positive magnetic anomalies. Now, bear in mind, the same phenomena appears in both sides of the scale. We tend to find the abduction, the mutilation, the UFOs, the cryptids. They tend to primarily appear around these particular areas. Skinwalker Ranch, as you rightly stated, is one of those areas.
In the book, The Deception of Gods and Men, you rely on the skull experiments to buttress the case that you make. Can you tell us, for those of us who don't know much about it, can you describe what it was? You said it lasted 5 years, and there were some really strange experiences that you describe in your book. Describe the focus of the study, the kinds of things that they experienced, and what you draw out of that.
Sure. The Skull experiment was conducted in the village of Skull, which is on the eastern shores of the UK. And it was during the 1990s, over a 5-year period, that the experiments were held, which was a sitting of seance twice a week. And during this seance, there were items that would manifest into the seance room, and it acquired such attention that there was a line of scientists wanted to be involved to witness this and experience it for themselves, and they did, I have to say. There were things like objects would materialize within the room during these seance sittings. And one in particular was very, very interesting and very prophetic, I suppose, to my own work, when we consider that one of the beings that made itself known was a grey alien. Now, during the video presentation in which it appeared initially, it appeared in a blue hue on the TV screen. But because of that, it became known as Blue, the entity Blue. Nonetheless, it was a grey alien. And some of the other things that would have happened, there were parts of the body that would materialize. For instance, sitters would be able to feel this hand touch them on the shoulder, and they would be able to feel the hand, the cold nature of the hand, and follow the hand onto the wrist, into the lower arm, into the elbow, and there was nothing above it. There was just this part of the body materialized. So all this phenomena was materializing itself within the seance room, including this doorway that seemed to fluctuate and ripple within part of the basement where the seances were happening. Now, as I said, this happened for over a 5-year period. The details of the book of the encounters by Reverend is tremendous and very, very interesting when we consider that in the later aspects of the communications and the information that was being passed from the void, that we started to see this element of deception begin to appear. Now, one of the entities that came through was known as Sharoness. And that happened on March the 6th, 1998, when this entity came through and said and claimed it came from a dimension of nothingness. Now, this is also something that Robert Monroe had also experienced. This aspect of this. It was almost like a water of darkness that he would pass over during his out-of-body experiences. And he commented that there were things in the water that had a certain intelligence, almost a tribal intelligence, but sometimes would follow him back into here and now, which, of course, would open up the problems. But the Skull experiment itself was vital in understanding a lot of this particular phenomenon. And that in itself allowed us to understand the nature of the soul that each of us have, and this idea that when the soul returns to the void, it brings back this aspect of the knowledge that was gained through the life here and now, and that itself, it collects into this what we today know as the global consciousness, and Edgar Cayce referred to it as the Akashic records. Now, each of us have the ability to access this particular area. by using this perfected balance that we can attain within the trinity of ourselves, the body, spirit, and the soul. And from the pages of Opera Omnia, the texts speak of a power, the power a balanced soul has, and states actually that demons are afraid of a balanced soul, because the soul was there to protect the Trinity. And that in itself was exceptionally interesting to understand. Now, the soul, I should reiterate as well that the soul's job was to keep the body alive as long as possible. But, and this is something we have to recognize, it thrived in our lowest energies, and it dealt with our wants, our needs, and our lusts. So we had to curtail it. We had to find balance within that. And because if it became unbalanced, it created all sorts of problems. But yeah, so that's what the skull experiment was about. It was about communicating with the other side to try and gain information and knowledge from the other side to help us know what was possibly coming.
And in that communication, the other side being spirits, spiritual entities, where did they say they were from?
Yes, they said that they were spiritual entities. And again, this is where we have to take a step back from that, and we have to look at the phenomena itself and the way it interacted. So that in itself, it could be very, very damaging if we go full in to the skull experiment. It's, again, as I referred to earlier, the hook and bait. The problem is that when we start getting information from these particular means, and they can come across many various different ways. When we get information, for instance, they tell us 4 things that are wrong, but they'll tell us 1 thing that's right. We have this ability to ignore the 4 lies that have just been told, and we grab onto the one that has been told that is truthful. That's hook and bait. It is that thing that really, it destroys the human race in its aspect that we completely ignore every other sense, and just acknowledge the fact that okay, everything else is, ignore everything else. It's just told me a certain truth there, so it must be right. And that's what we see through, and it's not just the skull experiment. We see this through all of the paranormal fields and the fringe fields as well. And that in itself is exceptionally damaging. We have to step back from that. And what I have found, whenever I start to apply this inquisitive nature to the phenomena, it is absolutely amazing how the moment that you become suspicious of the phenomena, it hightails it out of there. The communication stops because we become suspicious of it.
That happened with the skull experiment, right? It happened with the skull experiment. Suddenly they said, we're out of here.
Yeah, that was happening there as well. And the skull experiment came to an end because they said they were getting interference from the future, and there was something coming back to interfere with the phenomena. And they said there will be no more communication from their spirit guides and the spirit team and everything else. But that was not the case, because later on, outside of the skull experiment, communication was developed again with the spirit team. So again, that's where we see another lie that has happened. That alarm bell should be ringing, but instead we ignore it.
So these spirits on the other side, communicating with humans through the skull experiments, telling these humans that they are on the other side, they're spirits. They appear, at least in one case, looking like a gray alien. It made me think of, and you mentioned Aleister Crowley in your book, remember you think of the demon that he called up, something demonic that he called up that looked just like a big-headed gray alien.
Yes, he did do that, all right. Aleister Crowley also felt or came victim as well to this idea that we could control it. And during one of the particular processes in I believe it was the Middle East, he had formed his safe area in which the spirit could manifest, and he would be safe. Instead, it stepped out over the circle and walked across and beat the living hell out of him. So there again was another was another lie that was placed in front of him, and he failed to see it. This idea that we were safe with it. It really is. It is something that within the book I really try and harness. That we need to get back to who we are. We need to start listening to our instincts and understanding what this phenomena is.
You know, not to get off on a tangent here, but Bob Lazar, I know a lot of people have different thoughts about his credibility and everything, but one of the reports he said he read when he worked out there was about the soul, that the aliens or these beings saw us as containers and presumably containers of souls, that's why they were here. That's what they're interested in.
Yes. I can sympathize with that, because as I said earlier, he who wins the body he who has the body wins. Their idea that they want to come back to here, let's face it, as the Skull experiment showed us, that they came from a dimension of nothingness, which in itself is exceptionally close to us. That dimension is very, very close to us here and now. So they want to come back. This aspect of the soul wants to come back and stay here as long as possible.
And these beings, these spirits, have they always been here, always longer than us?
I have to say, when we're identifying, we shouldn't call them spirits. I see them more as soul shadow. There's two phrases there that I would use: soul and shadow. The spirit is gone. At moment of death, the spirit is gone. We do not have communication with the spirit anymore. It's gone. What we are communicating with in all our Ouija board experiments, within the UFO experiences and everything else, is the soul. That's what we are communicating with, not the spirit. It's a very different part of us altogether, and it is gone at point of death.
So no afterlife.
Oh no, I'm definitely not saying that. The soul, or sorry, the spirit goes somewhere. But it's interesting that when we go back far enough, and for instance, if we go back to the Norse traditions, who themselves adapted those traditions from people within Syria and within the Fertile Crescent, they were the people who were building these passage chambers, these stone mounds that appear across Europe and also appear here in Ireland. Now, I have mentioned them earlier whenever I said that I saw these two particular bodies walking away from me, which in Irish tradition we would call them the fairy. Here we also call them the she. Now, that in itself is probably a wrong term, because when we consider the she are the mounds, the stone mounds in which these things came through. Those were the places, those were the liminal places that our ancestors, the Neolithic, went to communicate with them. And it is these places, these stone constructs, that we tend to find these particular doorways that activate at certain times of the year. And for us, on that particular standing, this tie-in with stone is very, very important. And when we consider the likes of David Paulides and his work in Missing 411, he has also commented that the majority of people disappear, and I might add that they also disappear within heightened magnetic anomalies. The majority of people disappear in boulder fields. We're back to stone. And when we look then at the idea of the fairy aspect, within England you have a particular entity known as a goblin. Now, in itself, we laugh about the idea, we think it's hilarious. But goblin himself originates from the old French gobelin, which originates from the old Germanic kob, which means hole in stone. This is something that's coming from the rocks. And this is something that we tend to find a lot of, that these particular appearances, especially for the shining ones, we touched on them earlier, the Anunnaki and things like that. These shining ones appear around boulder fields. They'll appear in caves. They'll appear on stone plateaus. And those are my nemesis, I have to say. I have a real thing against them. And they come forward and they tell us about all this stuff that's happening and how we need to be better and all the rest. It's all rubbish. Because within the first 20 seconds, we have to understand the signals from our body. And more times than not, our body is screaming at us to get the hell out of there, because it's not what we perceive it to be. Our soul is indicating to us the nature of that particular phenomena, and that bleeds through into our fight or flight. That's when our body kicks in, and before that, when the body kickstarts the fight or flight, we should be listening to that. The hair stands up in the back of our necks. We should be leaving that area. Instead, they hook and bait us, and that's where we stop, and we're paralyzed with fear. And the likes of various different appearances of the Shining Ones happen right across the planet. And Europe, of course, is no exception. The likes of Medjugorje in 1981, 6 children saw this aspect of Our Lady appear. And we have to be very, very careful about the use of lady on these particular terms, because a lot of these stories and encounters have been smoothed out over time, and the real details are within the first 20 seconds. The children that seen the entity at Medjugorje in 1981, they were frozen with fear. That speaks volumes. Our bodies are screaming to us, get away from here. But instead, within the first 20 seconds, it overrides it. And that's whenever it forces us into the theta rhythm. Lourdes is another example. 1858, St. Bernadette saw this entity within the cave, another rock face in France. Now, bear in mind that this was overridden and smoothed out because the references to Our Lady didn't appear until later. Bernadette herself admitted that when she referred to the entity, she referred to it as that thing. Now, again, it speaks volumes of what these things are within the first 20 seconds. Our bodies, our instincts, our psychic, if you like, are all interpretations of the soul. It's how the soul interprets the environment around us. And our soul speaks to us through the reactions of the body. And it's how we interpret that and how we move that forward and how we can defeat the phenomena in the way that it wants to interact with us.
Our senses can be manipulated and deceived, sight and sound and smell, things of that sort, but our innate sense often alerts us, even though our eyes are telling us something different. I remember reading this book. It was by a guy named William Bramley, who I believe was an attorney, who started to write a book about the root causes of war and ended up at a strange place and a strange conclusion that he never saw coming, basically feeling that there were external forces, presumably aliens, that were manipulating public events, earthly planetary events on a massive scale to entice us into wars, to manipulate us into getting into conflicts in which large numbers of humans get killed. I wonder if you have read that book and whether or not you feel that it sort of supports the thesis that you're describing in your book.
Well, I have to say, George, I've never read the book, and it's my first time of hearing about it. But for me to understand this particular phenomena, which relates to that particular book, I started pulling on information from the Marian Library, which is an International Marian Research Institute in Dayton, Ohio. And that in itself, I started to look at this aspect of the Shining Ones, which we spoke about before the break. Who are they? Where are they coming from? Now, the Guardian newspaper on March the 11th, 2017, ran a headline, "The 1930s were humanity's darkest and bloodiest hour. Are you paying attention?" Well, that actually wasn't quite right. Because what we tended to find within our research is that a decade before war breaks out, major war, their appearance in negative magnetic anomalies outnumber all others. So 10 years before a major war breaks out, we tend to see an influx of these particular Marian apparitions, these Shining Ones appear around the world. World War I, World War II, Korean War, Bosnian War, the global war on terrorism, they all made their appearance. Now, what does that mean? You know, from our aspect and our understanding of this particular phenomena, we then started to see another pattern because our attention then was drawn to the negative magnetic anomalies. These are the places where we tended to find, again, the typical poltergeist activity, UFO mutilations, cryptid encounters, and all the rest. But there was a difference here within the negative magnetic anomalies. It was a different kettle of fish. This place is where you tended to find a majority of sacrificial worship from our ancestors in the past. A blood worship, if you like, that spilling of blood was huge in these particular areas. Now, initially, I came across some research which made me pay attention, but not enough at the time. But it came back into it later on, because 75% of the world's top suicide locations appear in negative anomalies. What is it that's pulling people, drawing people to these locations to end their lives? That certainly is not a positive outcome. But it was also interesting that when we started looking at the negative anomalies in more detail, 70% of the world's weapons development labs and storage areas are also found in these areas. And that seemed to come, that then itself didn't seem to come across by chance. And, this idea that we can communicate with these things is nothing new, because there were areas within the past, there were hard to reach areas that were known as places of oracle that I spoke about earlier, that island of the dead. It was a place where you could make a pilgrimage to ask assistance of this spiritual interpreter. And you either slept on the location or you had communication from the other side via an intermediary. Now, these particular practices originated within the Near East, countries such as Syria and things like that. And like, as I said before, the movement of the passage chambers went right across Northern Europe into the British Isles, where we find them today. And when you went to these areas, if we look at the Greek perspective, for instance, there was a god that we would know as Pan, this horned, hoofed deity that would appear within these areas. But that wasn't the one I was interested in. What I was interested were this phenomena that was known as the Word. This phenomena is the one that came through, and we're giving guidelines to our elite, to our rulers, to our priests on how to rule us through sociology, government, economics, warfare, crime, medicine, engineering, and science. The information was coming back through these particular channels. And that was during the Greek times. We're talking before Christianity and things like that. And to find that then starting to slip through into the mainstream, because it's not only the paranormal, the people that are investigating the paranormal and things like that end up in these places channeling. And, we might sneer at the idea that, well, channeling, it's just people having a bit of a laugh in the background. That's not the case. Scientists and engineers have been using channeling today in this modern age to get ahead of the current technological challenges. That's a tongue twister. And an instance of that, I can let you know, comes from Douglas Aeronautics in 1968, before being absorbed into Boeing in 1987. They were trying to make contact with this particular being, to try and get ahead of current engine designs from so-called aliens, that in itself was absolutely phenomenal to come across, to have the paperwork that shows that they were getting funding to follow this particular Ouija board session to channel information about engine design. This is not something that happens in your basement. This is something that was also happening at a higher level to try and get ahead. And as I said earlier, in the Christianity, we were certainly going to these areas, these key areas, these liminal places in which information was being passed from these things on how to govern us.
we've had conversations in the years past, Barry, about hotspots, paranormal hotspots, UFO hotspots, places where a lot of different kinds of phenomena spill over into each other. And you've noticed you've noticed trends, commonalities between these hotspots. Some of them, in terms of elements that are in the soil. Others, I think you mentioned in this book that some of these places have already been picked out by religions, where they build temples, where they build churches, and things of that sort. It's not a coincidence that they pick those places.
Absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of this goes back thousands of years. This is how we were able to track it. It goes back thousands of years. Now, there were unconfirmed reports that suggest that Carl Jung spoke to a delegation of U.S. military when addressing the UFO phenomena. He stated, "We may be looking at a mass Babylonian death ritual." Now, that of course is unconfirmed. I can't support that. I can just reference it. But it is interesting that after the Douglas fiasco of channeling for the UFO engine designs, Boeing, of course, took them in, and a rival firm also went on to develop an AI weapons platform, which is in use today, which is called Astarte, possibly a nod to the Mesopotamian goddess of war, Astarte. So again, the information is there. We can see it, and possibly the references, the nods to its longevity, goes all the way back to Babylon, and that's where we lose it. There is no written text after that. So as far as we can go is back to the Fertile Crescent, and then that's it. We lose it beyond then.
Well, let's stick with that point for a moment in the UFO realm. There have been some pretty interesting studies done by folks, Bass, OSAP, passed on to ATIP, about the consequences of people who have close encounters, physical damage that as a result, radiation burns, things of that sort, because they're exposed to technology. Now, you wouldn't think that spirits, elementals, would need technology. So how do you reconcile that, how they would use technology, including AI, as part of the grand deception?
Well, that's where it gets complicated, because we have to revert back to this knowing that 70% of our weapons platforms and weapons development also originate within negative passage or negative magnetic anomalies. Because there's a distinct difference between the original phenomena, pre-19th century, and what comes after that. And what comes after that, what I'm seeing anyway from my perspective, is a much higher output on electromagnetic frequencies that could be interpreted, of course, as weapons, if you like, and used and tested out on humanity. And that's where it gets very, very complicated, because we live in a society now where our technology essentially is somewhat better than the original, and it becomes very clouded when we have interactions with them and we have interactions with our own technology. And I tend not to get involved with our own technology, because that's dark enough as it is, and my focus was primarily on what is going through the void, more so than what we have made contact with to advance our situation within the global platform and beyond. So so it gets very, very complicated and very murky when we start delving into and start splitting the original phenomena from the new phenomena, the likes of our it interfering with our technology, with it shutting down our bodily systems, and what comes out of that, of course, and of course, being shot with lasers is not a fun thing either, so all of this phenomena, in the modern sense, we can find the patents for within the U.S. Patent Office. The technology's there. Whether we like to accept it or not, the technology is there and has been known about for a long time. And I think we're seeing that within the technology that we are building. But that again is another subject, I feel, and I primarily deal with those of the ancient past.
But you think that they could also adapt technology to carry out their ends?
I find that they have problems developing technology per se. The way that they interact with us has never really changed. So they're exceptionally slow at adapting. And I think part of that as well may be from where they're coming from. And this idea that we have of time, for us, of course, time is linear. But for them, it's somewhat different. And we have many different tales within their mythology and folklore that speak of time operating differently when the victim is taken across. And you know, we're told that maybe only 5 minutes could turn out to be 3 hours, or a day could turn out to be 50 years back here on Earth. So for them to come through and make their appearance and then disappear back beyond the veil for, say, maybe half a day, you could be looking at 100 years that could have passed in between. So for them, time hasn't changed, which again shows itself within the phenomenon which it interacts with us. It hasn't really changed over the millennia. The technology that we are building is advancing at leaps and bounds that in itself is far out surpassing what they are able to come up with.
Yeah, well, if they can manipulate us on a mass scale, as you say they have demonstrated over the centuries, they can just rely on us to make the technology and to carry out their ends.
Absolutely, yeah, very much so. And you know, there was a lot of promise given to those powers that be of power, wealth, and greed, and that is the Achilles heel of the human race, and that is something we will never change from.
Meaning that we will always fall for that. They dangle some riches in front of our face, and they'll get some of us to do whatever they want.
Unfortunately, that is the way it is, and that's the way it's going to be. And that's the sad news, I'm afraid.
I don't imagine this book is going to be all that popular with churches, with organized religion.
I would imagine not. You know, the idea that when the soul, the spirit leaves, and the spirit, I didn't really delve too much within this aspect of the spirit per se. But there have been associations with the Old Norse traditions, pre-Christian, which appear to resonate with the idea of the river Styx, for instance, the idea that the dead crossed this body of dark water to reach the other shore, and when this spirit crossed to this other place, they went over this bridge, and they crossed through a gate. Into this particular area that was known as a real place of beauty, of rich green landscapes, which today we would see as heaven. You know, there have been instances of out of body experiences where people come back and say, "Well, this is what I saw," and they walked through a gate, and there was people on the other side, and it was all beauty and everything else. In the Old Norse traditions, that place existed, and you went through the gates, you got to the other side, and there were people there. That was a place of transit. That's where you met your friends and relatives and everything else, and then you went to where you were meant to go. But this is where it gets complicated and becomes an inconvenient truth, because that place was known as hell. And Saxo Grammaticus, he was a Danish historian from 1160 to 1220 AD. He describes hell as a place of beauty, replete with the green landscapes of late spring. It was a place in total contrast to the later Christian depictions of evil, darkness, and treachery, which were absorbed through the Greek traditions of Hades, and those, and really, really driven home after the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century.
Barry, I know that from your research in the UFO area, you're familiar with the recent findings, and it's almost a trend where people, respected authorities, people who've been around this subject for a long time, will say that these ETs, these aliens, whatever they are, wherever they're from, have been healing humans. They help us. They have our interests at heart. They take us on board their ships. They heal illnesses, things of that sort, wounds. They really have are watching out for us. Is it possible that some of that is real, that there actually are ETs? I don't see how they could be mutually exclusive from the entities that you're describing.
Some of the encounters can have positive outcomes. That is for sure. But when we start looking at the whole thing as a whole, that's whenever we start to see, like as before we indicated, the same phenomena of the same, or the different faces of the phenomena of the same coin. In the 1970s, there were a series of experiments that were conducted by the University of Indiana, and they devised to make contact with UFOs using what we would know today as beaming lights into the sky. This wish to make contact with the UFO phenomena, and they established the primary contact with these lights that flash back and everything else, but they just didn't understand the phenomena itself. They didn't understand their body's reaction to it either. Now, this was prior to today's CE5 establishments and everything else. But the events that followed, they really reflected the findings of other scientific investigations by the Livermore laboratories in the United States, described by Russell Targ. And as the experiments continued, the students began to experience these strange, hollow, rapping sounds, disembodied voices, furious poundings in the walls, and physical attacks by these unseen entities. And this went on and on and on. And in itself, the very, very similar phenomena began to happen within the Livermore laboratories, in which led to the abandonment of the experiment because of its very nature. Now, that in itself, of course, is just a slight overview of where we see this commonality coming down through it. And some of the encounters, as I say, have been positive in nature, but the problem is that the phenomena itself is very, very hard to determine whether you're contacting the positive outcome or the negative outcome. And I think Dr. Bob Curran, he's a fellow researcher here from Northern Ireland. In his conclusion in his book, Dark Fairies, he sums up the real threat behind many of these sweet images that we have of fairies. The idea of a kindly fairy helping out a distressed human is something of a myth. Indeed, in many cases, they were feared and avoided if possible. And that sums it up beautifully.
In Jacques Vallée, his passport to Magonia, he came up with the idea, along with John Keel, the idea that these same beings that we describe today as aliens or ETs are essentially the same as elves, fairies, goblins, creatures of folklore that were described centuries ago. Your idea takes it a step further, that we were probably closer to the truth the first time around, that, yeah, they are the same things, but they're closer to the elementals than they are to ETs.
They're not even close to the elementals. The ETs, the elementals, all that are just masks of the phenomena. We have to strip the mask away to look at the phenomena itself, the way it interacts with us. And within that, we can find what we're actually looking at. And that in itself, to understand that, we have to look at the entire umbrella. And we can't just nitpick. We have to look at it all. And when we do that and we work together, and this is an important thing, the field as a whole needs to work together. We can no longer pigeonhole the phenomena and say, well, this belongs to here and this belongs to there. That's not the case. What we're seeing is this common factor that weaves its way through it all. And the way that it interacts with us speaks volumes, especially when we start using cameras. Because the original phenomena, and I'm talking pre-19th century, that phenomena still occurs today. But when we bring a camera to the location, recording equipment to the location, 9 times out of 10, they will not take part in the experiment. And a lot of times, even if we secretly hide the camera that can have a negative effect as well, because they interpret what we think. They're able to get into our thought processes and understand that. We try and outsmart them. They are already one step ahead because they read what we are doing. They read what we think. The impulse that we have is detectable by them. There are processes, however, in which you can hide that. And that brings us back into an esoteric path. And to understand this phenomena, we have to understand it from an esoteric path. And that in itself leads us into another area altogether. A lot of the phenomena, in fact, the majority of the phenomena, in its truest sense, can be manifested. And that in itself, call it for what you want, it is an esoteric occult practice. And that has been used by our ancients for thousands of years.
I know that bringing it back, I don't hate to keep bringing it back to Skinwalker, but, those teams, 3 different groups of investigators at that ranch all say the same thing, that no matter what they try to do, this phenomena, this intelligence can always figure it out. They're always one step ahead. Same thing. They also say that, a lot of the people who've been there have what they call hitchhikers. They bring something home with them. It's an attachment. You have been at these kinds of places all over the world, ghosts, hauntings, UFO sites, cryptid creatures, all that. Have you ever taken something home, and how do you explain that?
Following my escapade on the island of the dead, I returned back home, and I was sitting in the lounge with my wife, and the fire was lit, and I was just documenting my experiences on the laptop. And both of us were facing the door that was open in the hallway. On the door, it was a glass door. Both of us looked up remarkably at the same time. And standing in the hallway was a dark shadow looking at us, standing in the hallway. And it was looking at us as we were sitting, looking at it. And within the space of a second and a half, it was gone. And I got up to give chase, but it was gone. But yes, there is the potential to bring things back. There was a series of experiments that were conducted some time ago, maybe 10 years ago, EVP experiments. And these experiments went right around the world. And the same question was being asked time and time again. How do you see us? And it kept coming back as light. Now, that didn't correlate with me whenever I was writing the book, The Influence, because whenever I initially began that project, I was given this warning at the very beginning, which I included in the book. Don't become too bright or they see you. And that really, really hit home when the EVP experiments were conducted, and they said, how do you see us? As light. So that in itself spoke volumes to me, and about how we can attract bright lights, attract flies, and we can do that, and that can be a problem sometimes, and that's something we have to look about exploring. How do we remove them? And there, of course, there are areas in which religious areas which will look at that on how to remove attachments and things there. But there are other areas as well that we can also look at.
Yeah, some of the people who have these hitchhikers from Skinwalker have had them for a decade.
They can stay for a long time because they need the hook. They need to be able to bait you and attach and hang on. Because if they don't have an attachment initially, if they don't have an attachment to us in whatever form, they are returned back to that void, that place of nothingness. And so they need to try and attach to us whatever way possible. And through that, of course, is the hook and bait, the deception.
My grandmother was Irish, and I have relatives there. I've never been, have planned it a couple of times, and it's fallen through. But I sometimes wonder if that is where my appreciation for these subjects comes from. It's something in the Irish DNA.
There is something in that, I have to say, and I went through my own DNA analysis to find out where does this meat suit come from, and I was very happy to see that over 50% was Celtic, part of it was belonged to the Nordic regions, and part of it Greek, and I said, well, I am exactly where I'm meant to be. And it really was one of those binding factors to this land. And you go through life wondering, is there anything else that I could be doing? But I'm exactly where I'm meant to be.
Yeah.
And that was proven through that analysis.
I think, Barry, you are optimistic about fighting back and overcoming, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It all comes down to choice. We have a choice, and it's although sometimes the choice may seem somewhat obscure, there is always a choice there, and we can make that choice to do good, or we can make the choice to do bad. We can decide, okay, well, what they're telling me, I can follow the direction and gain all the wealth that I need and power and everything else, and more to boot. All I have to do is turn my back on humanity and stand on those in the lower echelons. But we have a choice. We can turn away from that, and it always comes down to choices.
Do you know about the archons, Barry?
The archons, yeah. Now, of course, within common school of thought, the archons came from space and came down and started to rule the human race. But the traditional use of the word archon from the scripts identify archon as being someone of foreign stature, and that particular address and use of the word archon was usually derived to a Roman ambassador, someone who was ruling that particular area at the time that those ancient scripts were being written about, and that has been convoluted and distorted through time. To now, we see the archons as being something which is outside the planet and is governing the human race. Well, that initially that use of the word was not meant for that particular purpose. It was destined for a more down to earth address of a ruler of a foreign land.
Oh, by the way, my ad, the Nexus magazine, I do get it, and it's always got packed with interesting information. That article you mentioned about cloaking technology is one that we've addressed here before. Our guest, Robert Guffey, who wrote a book called Camelio, believes that this is technology being used by our government, by government agencies, to sort of manipulate and scare the crap out of citizens. There's a lot of... My name is George Knapp, your occasional host. What becomes of us? What becomes of our soul after we die, the physical death? Are we good enough to make the cut after we die? And we assume there's an afterlife. Many of us assume that anyway. We point to encounters with angels that are told through the ages, though we're warned about fallen angels as well. Beings of light are reported, beings of darkness too. Yin and yang, the oldest story of all, the only story really. But what if we are being manipulated on an indescribable scale throughout humanity?